Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to be looking at the setup of the safety reporting side. This is going to be slightly unusual in that we're going to do both training on the setup as well as some recommended best practices. Obviously, you don't have to take everything I say as gospel, but as long as I can make you think about how you've set up your site, then I will be very happy. Right, so we're going to dive right in. To start with, we click on Setup at the top right, and the safety module setup is on the right-hand side here. The first thing you should verify when starting to use the system, or even if you're a long-time user, is the risk matrix. This is critically important throughout the entirety of the safety module. Specifically, you have your likelihood options and the identifier and the consequences and their identifiers, and they are carried through to this table at the bottom, which we'll come back to in a moment. So the description, how do you define extremely improbable? How do you define improbable? How do you define remote? And it's quite important that these are as specific as possible. The reason being that these descriptions are available to reporters when they are logging a report. So having this as specific as possible, and ideally it should reflect your approved SMS manual, is helpful to reporters when deciding what the appropriate risk level is. Then we have enabled checkboxes. That's if you revise your SMS manual and have a simpler risk matrix with fewer options, you can disable one of these, and meaning it will no longer be available for selection, but it will still appear in your historical records. The consequences are the same. It's important to have complete descriptions here. So for example, when we say low financial loss, what is low financial loss? Can you assign a specific amount to a low financial loss? And then the risk itself. So here in our risk matrix, we have 4 possible risks. We have a description of each. So for a medium risk, we need to have controls, and we need to try and reduce it to low through those controls. You can also have timeframes, again, as per your approved procedures, and you can set a color. And the color corresponds to the risk down here. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. Again, we have enabled or disabled in case you no longer wish to use one of these options. So you can see in the risk matrix itself, we have the likelihood at the top on the x-axis, and we have the consequences here on the y-axis. Each of these identifiers is automatically generated. So E1 comes from negligible, which has an identifier of E, and extremely improbable, which has an identifier of 1. Your particular risk matrix may not look like this, and you can change what the risk level of each of these identifiers is by clicking Edit on the right-hand side here. So I can say that D4 is actually high risk or is actually low risk. And you can customize it that way. So once you have done that, then we're going to go through the safety options. So for reporting, there are 2 setup pages. There's safety custom fields, which is the contents of the report, and safety options, which is the structure surrounding the reporting system. And the first thing we have here, Chief Safety Officer. So by itself, this doesn't necessarily do anything. This is a list where you can define who the chief safety officers are for your company, and the system will refer to this selection when processing reports or discretion reports, for example. This is a role, and we'll go through where the system will look at these selections later on. Then we have some checkboxes, reporter can submit to authorities. Authorities are set up here, and it's basically any entity, be it a person or a company, to which you'd like to submit a summary of a report. So that could be your regulator, who require mandatory occurrence reports. It could be a client who require your hazard reports, for example. Anything where you'd like to send something. So generally, you don't necessarily want your reporter to submit to that. You'd rather have the safety manager review the report first, maybe process it a bit, make sure the risk level is correct, and then you can send it through. Reporter can view forums and actions. So the actual processing of reports is outside the scope of this webinar. We do have some training videos up on processing reports, and I will link those in the description when I upload this to YouTube. But assuming that you know what that means, the reporter is able to see the report being processed and the corrective actions that are raised from it, even if they're not on the investigation team. And this is a great option to have enabled because it promotes an open safety culture, which obviously is something that we all strive for in aviation. Hide reporter and report manager contact details. Again, this is something that you probably want to have ticked. What it does is when you select a person in the report or export the report or send it to an authority, it hides their personal details like the address on their profile, their cell phone number, their email address, etc. It'll just give you the name and their title. Allow company to view status and outcomes. This enables or disables the report under general, reporting, and status and outcomes. And again, this is a nice thing to have because it is useful for your open safety culture. It is giving, it allows you to see a brief summary of the reports in the system, assuming that the person is allowed to see it in their access levels and what the current status of it is. Okay, going back to our safety options, we have send new forum post notification emails to the investigation personnel. So as it says, when there's a new post in the forum, everyone listed in the investigation personnel gets an email. And I will show you where that is set up when we go through these report types. Allow individuals to override new forum post notification emails. Generally, I recommend that this is disabled. What that does is it means when the person is submitting a comment to the forum, they can stop that email being sent. And more often than not, it's a good idea to have that email sent just so no one misses anything. So taking away that option can resolve some questions. Okay, I've got an email here from one of our attendees, which says, how does an individual override new forum post notification emails? And there will be a checkbox that says send or do not send. In fact, I'll take you through an example. Let's go and find an open safety report. So here's one under investigation. We'll go to the forum. I can click new comment, and I can select or deselect this send notification checkbox. So if that is deselected, the investigation personnel here will not receive an email. And the setting in safety options chooses whether that checkbox is available or not. Okay, then we have enable risk levels to be set per action. And that is exactly as it says. When you raise an action, you can assign a risk to it. Generally, I tend to think of it as what's the likelihood and consequences if this action is not done, that will give you a risk level, and that helps you sort which corrective actions are very high priority and which can be left a little bit longer. Report manager sends first alerts. Again, this is quite a nice one to have, as long as your safety manager is on the ball. What it means is when a report is submitted, the person designated to process that report gets a chance to review it before notification of that report is sent out. So let's say, for example, your crew are not necessarily that good at choosing risk levels. Maybe it's a failing in your risk matrix in the descriptions, or maybe it's a lack of training on their end. But having that ticked means that maybe you or your safety manager gets to look over the report, amend any details that are incorrect, such as the risk level, and once you are happy, then you can send out the reports and start the investigation process. And I'll show you where that ties into these report type tabs. We have the champion or investigator title. So this is the title of the person managing the report. It's not necessarily the same thing as a job title. So in the Australian term is champion. It's the person pushing the report through the phases. And then we have allow request for corrective action requestee to edit root cause, remedial, and corrective action. So the standard process flow when you send out a corrective action is that the requestee, the person to whom the corrective action is sent, has to give you your root cause, remedial, and corrective actions. This option was introduced in version 3.3. It means that when a person responds to a corrective action, then they will be able to fill out those fields directly. So that's a good one to have. I do recommend it. Then we have our report types tab. So here are the different types of report. And the reason why you would want more than one type of report is because you can, well, obviously they're for different purposes, but you can have vastly different contents for each report. So for a flight, you don't necessarily, for example, need a bird strike report and an air prox report and an ACAS report, a poor weather. That can all be handled under flight report with some conditional formatting. But where you have to have separate types, this is where you can create them by clicking Add New. We have the report type, so the name of the report type, the short name, where it needs to be condensed, prefix. So this is the letters that come before your report numbering. So for example, our flight report, the first one submitted on the system will be FLT1. Second one will be FLT2, dangerous goods, DGR1, DGR2, etc. Description. So what's this report used for? These descriptions are no good whatsoever. And I've left them in as examples. This one is better because it helps your crew decide which type of report they need to submit for this. So it gives us the scope, an incident or accident that affects or could affect safety, security, aircraft, personnel, and environment between the time that any person boards the aircraft with the intention of flight or until everyone is disembarked. So we have a scope and time frame at which this is applicable, which is great. Then we have the officer/role name. So this can be a job title, but basically it's the name of the role that is responsible for the processing of this report. And I'll show you where that carries through to. It's not necessarily ever going to be in use, depending on the structure of your company. We have active or inactive. So if a report is inactive, nobody will be able to lodge any new ones of that type, but your historical ones will still be in the system. Then we have excluded from status and outcomes. So under global settings, we enabled the status and outcomes report, but for reports which might be sensitive, you can hide it. So for example, a drug test, you don't want that spread throughout the company. You can hide it using this checkbox. Then we have edits, which, as you saw, just allows me to change these fields. And you'll note that some of these have a bin next to them. And you can only delete reports, report types that have never been submitted. So for example, this quality report, there's never been a quality report submitted on this site, so I can delete it. If there has been a drug test submitted, so I cannot delete that because that would interfere with my records. You'll note that each of these report types corresponds to one of these tabs up here, and we'll go through those shortly. Here we have report authorities. So as I mentioned, these are your mandatory occurrence reporting, your client notifications, anything that will streamline your life. So we can list disabled authorities to see old ones. We don't have any right now. We can add a new one. So let's make another SACAA part 127. And we can say r127 at caa.co.za. So each email address goes into its own separate box. I can add myself here as well. And maybe you want to add the CEO of the company as well, like so. Description: who is this authority? What relation do they have to us? So they could say, I could say part 127 operations.
I don't.
Regulator for mandatory occurrence reporting. On the right-hand side here, we can choose which types of report can get sent to this authority. So I'm not interested in sending my defect reports to the CAA. They'll just need my flight reports. They might need incident reports as well, but again, there's no reason to have an incident report when you have a flight report, because that is just a level of occurrence. And you can see a summary here of which types of report can be sent to each authority. Then we have report categories. So this is actually quite a critical part of your safety setup, and it's worthwhile to spend a good long time thinking about how you want this to be structured. So this control itself is called a tree. You'll see them throughout Air Maestro. They're quite useful. And essentially, this is a way to categorize your reports into different types of events. So you have obviously your incident, serious incident, accident, etc. But then you also want to see how many bird strikes or bird-related incidents have I had? How many bird-related accidents have I had? And this is where you can start doing that. So we have quite a few things here because this is a demonstration site. We play around with it a lot. Right now, we're more or less in line with ADREP 2000. We're still working on it. But we've got it sorted into defect, flight, ground, and quality. So ADREP 2000 only really deals with flight flight occurrences. So we've got our own OHS ones and our own quality ones. So these defect, flight, ground, and quality are not ones that you will find in the ADREP taxonomy, but we're using those to sort the list into more manageable chunks for the reporter. So you can see here we've got abrupt maneuver, abnormal runway contact, bird strikes, evacuation, and all of the, if you sort your reports properly into all of these, then you will get more useful statistics out of your dashboards. So the ADREP 2000 taxonomy only has fuel related, but I think that for my purposes as safety manager on this site, I actually want to drill down a little bit further and see, was it contamination? Was it the incorrect fuel type, mismanagement, starvation? For Mac ACAS reports, I want to see, was it a collision? Was it a loss of separation? Did we receive an RA or a TA? So there's nothing in the system stopping you from drilling down just a little bit further, because these codes are what these codes here are what ADREP is interested in. Again, security, I could potentially put this here under quality, but I think these ones are more relevant to a flight report. All right, as you've seen, some of these are labeled as inactive. So what that means is, as before, when something is inactive, any records you have for that selection will be kept, but it's no longer available when you are submitting a new report. So airframe and electrical, these are old categories that we're no longer using. I've replaced them with non-power plant component failures and malfunctions with the SCF NP from ADREP, and then I've broken that down for my own purposes here. And once you've done that, you'll have a flight report, which is labeled as an incident, and then the category would be bird strike, for example. So all of those come together in that way for your statistics. Then we have report summary email templates. So when someone is notified of a report, this is the email that is sent to them. And you can, you can set a template for each type of report. Any of these fields that you see in between percentage marks, that's information that's automatically going to be drawn from the report itself. So the report number will be followed by this piece of data, which is drawn from the report that was submitted. If for any reason you delete one of these, you can always just drag it back in from the right-hand side here. At the moment, these are the only pieces of information that can be drawn in. However, you can put ideas up in the ideas portal if you'd like to see more. So as I mentioned, you can edit per report type, but if there is no template, then it will go back to the default over here. This is rich text. You can put in hyperlinks, you can put in bullet points, coloring, anything you like. All right, then on to the really important part, is the report type setup. So for our flight report, we have this here, Flight Safety Manager. This text is being drawn from whatever was put in here. So if I come and put a AA there, you will see that our flight report changes to Flight Safety Manager AA. So again, just like the Chief Safety Officer, this is a role selection. You might have differing levels of responsibility per report type, and this is going to help you do that. And I'll show you where it does that a little bit further down. Again, this is a checkbox list. I can select as many people as I like and click Set Role to apply that. So as far as the roles go, Chief Safety Officer here in Global Settings is across the entire site. This role is for this report only, and you can also subdivide responsibilities per base. So you can say, let's go to our locations register and look at Ibiza. In the base details tab, I can click Edit. And down at the bottom here, we can specify that for Ibiza, I need this person to be involved in any investigations. And then if we go back to our safety options and look at the flight report again, we can see that I have that selection there. So again, that is a role. How that role is applied is covered down here in these tables, which we'll come to a little bit later. Then we have some options per report type. So these selections, unlike the ones in global settings, are applied only to the flight report. We have reporter can view and set initial risk. So view initial risk, we have a default risk rating here. So the person can see that. And if you want, they can also change that to what they think is appropriate for this report. Whether you want that or not is entirely up to you as a company. It's usually nice to get some input from the guys on the ground, so have it set if you can. Add initial alert personnel to investigation personnel if they are different. So for example, you could say, I need to notify the CEO or the accountable manager of all new safety reports, but I don't want them involved in the investigation unless they want to be. In that case, I can deselect that. And that means that the lists of initial alert and investigation personnel can be different. Allow investigation personnel to add additional investigation personnel via the forums. So what this does is when you submit a forum post and you tag someone for a follow-up, they will be added to the list of investigation personnel for that particular report because they are now involved. They have something to contribute because they have been tagged. If you disable that, then you will still be able to tag them, but they will not be added to the list of investigation personnel. They will not receive notifications of the continuing investigation. Initial likelihood, initial consequence, so the default settings. The report prefix, this is exactly the same as we saw here in report types. And if I change it here, let's just make it capitals. Make it flight occurrence report. Then you'll see that that changes there. It's the exact same field, just presented in two separate places. Then we have optional fields. Category is what we set up here. So for something like, let's say you want to cover the minutes of meetings using the reporting form, which is quite possible. And in fact, we have a guide up on our help desk on how to do that. Then you would not need a category because you don't need to report on those. So you can select as hidden. Event description, that is a text box at the bottom of the very first page where you make a report type selection. You can make it mandatory, optional, or hidden. Event location, which is distinct from the base. This is just a text field, which lets you put in a specific location in addition to a base, which is always required. Event type, this is your incident accident descriptor. And to customize that, we click on Setup at the top. Go to Air Maestro data. In this drop-down list, we can select safety event type. And here we have our options: hazard, incident, accident, major incident, and potential hazard. Potential hazard I've said separately because that one is currently inactive, so it cannot be selected. Then we have reporter role. So the person who submits the report, what were they doing at the time? And again, that can be customized here under safety reporter roles. And you can put in any roles that you require and disable any old ones that you do not. Okay, once you've made changes, remember to click Save to apply them. Then we have report tabs. So this is the meat of your report. This is where you capture relevant information to help you process it, to help you decide how you're going to mitigate this risk in the future. All of these report tabs are customized here in Safety Custom Fields. So let's go and have a look at that. The actual customization of these tabs is somewhat outside the scope of the webinar today. We do have another webinar up on our YouTube channel covering the use of the custom field builder, so I recommend you go and have a look at that. So what we have here is our tab register. These are all the tabs that are present on our site and available for use. If you want to retire a tab, so for example, this one here from our clinical report, patient details, we're not going to use that anymore. I can click edit and disable it. This champion only and mandatory, these are the default settings for this tab. Champion only means it's only for the use of the report manager, the person who processes the report, who opens the investigation, closes the investigation, requests sign-offs and closes it, not the investigation personnel. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Mandatory, any required fields, and this must be filled out. If mandatory is not selected, and ideally you must make sure it's selected here in the report type. Remember, these are only the default settings. If you have mandatory fields in a tab, but mandatory here is not selected, that tab can still be skipped. Send to authority. So you might have a tab that records some company-specific or sensitive information. You can deselect send to authority, and that will not be included in any summaries you send. Finally, we have this button here, which is make copy. So if you want to use an existing tab as a base and make some changes for a specific type of report, you can just duplicate it. And then you can select the tab you want to edit here. So let's say flight details. And we have our usual fields for aircraft registration, crew particulars, flight plan details, and details of occurrence. So depending on the age of your site, you may or may not have these. This is something that we added fairly recently, and I'll come back to it as to why it's so useful. Again, if you'd like to go over the use of the custom field builder, I recommend you check out that webinar. So to add a tab, we can click here. This will give us a drop-down list with all of the tabs that are currently available for selection, i.e. ones that are active and not disabled. Let's say I want to add equipment defect. These will be populated or ticked according to the default settings here, but you can always change them for the specific type of report. If I select champion only, we get some additional information. So this SOAM tab, for example. SOAM is a root cause analysis methodology. So I don't need the reporter to fill this out. This is for the use of the people processing the report. But I can allow other people to view it, such as the investigation personnel and the reporter. So again, that's a nice way to promote an open safety culture. I can demonstrate and show to the people and the stakeholders that I'm doing this root cause analysis. I can show that it's a just culture process, and that we're not looking to single out people, we're looking at the incident as a whole or holistically. Then let's look at environmental. We've got send to authority, so this, if I send this to an authority, it will be included. This tab is enabled, and I have display options. So this is where the system gets a bit clever. And here we can choose when the environmental tab, in this case it's poor weather, will be displayed to the reporter. So you can see that I actually have quite a few tabs in this report. And it's going to discourage reporting if reporters have to fill out all of those every single time. It's just too much work, and people are not going to want to do it, which is fair enough. So what I can do here is I can specify conditions from existing tabs that determine whether the environmental tab is shown or not. So let's go through this from scratch. By default, when you click here, the conditions will show like this. We can add a condition saying that under flight details, the type of occurrence, let's go back and just check what that's called, details of occurrence. No. Details of occurrence, the field is called, did the event encompass? There we go. So condition A, as you can see here, says that whenever poor weather is ticked in the flight details tab, then the environmental tab will be shown to the reporter so they can fill out those details. So, for example, for air prox and near collision, they don't need to fill that out if it has nothing to do with it. If it was a bird strike, they don't need to talk about air proxes. And so for air prox, we would just have that ticked and nothing else. And that's saying that whenever the reporter ticks this, something happens. So let's say I only want poor weather to show if poor weather is ticked and if there was damage. So we can see, did this occurrence result in injury or damage? And if they tick yes, that's another condition that I can have in. So let's say I only want the environmental tab to show if there was poor weather selected and if there was damage, in which case I can take conditions A and B and say the formula for this is A and B. So both of these things must be true in order for this tab to show. Or I can say, all right, I want this environmental tab to show if there was poor weather, but I also want it to show if there was any damage. So let's say it was an air prox, and there was no damage, and there was damage, but they haven't selected poor weather. In that case, I can go back here and say A or B. As long as either of those is selected, then the tab will show. And there's a little tooltip here to show you some examples of what you can do. I could also, for example, say not A. So what that means is whenever this is ticked, if poor weather was ticked, then the environmental tab would not show. If any of those were ticked, it would still show as normal. So there's a lot you could do here. And you can make some very clever processes to streamline your reporting. Going down, we have some quite important tables. And let's edit this one here. So you can see that each of these tables is split by risk level. And then we have 3 columns: Air Maestro alert, email, and SMS. Air Maestro alerts basically is just when you log in and you get to the occurrence page, you'll be notified of something there, and it'll also be in your alerts at the top here above your profile. And here we can specify roles or names. So you've heard me talk about roles before, and this is by far and away the way how I recommend that you set these up. So each of these 4 is going and looking somewhere else to decide who needs to be alerted. If you select people by name, then whenever that person changes, you have to come to all of these tables and make sure that you change it in every single box, and it takes quite a while. But let's say that our flight safety manager, this field here, changes. I can just come and change it here and say Jason is no longer involved. I'll set role, and that updates everything else. So if I had Jason selected there by name, I would have to come and remove it from here, remove it from here, 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 and so on, so on, so on. So where possible, use these roles. Chief Safety Officer, as we mentioned, is head of the global settings. These Flight Safety Manager, AA, is for this type of report specifically. So if I tick this, the system will come and look at who is selected in this drop-down list and then alert them. And then we have base flight safety managers. So these personnel, in this case Ruan for Ibiza, will only be notified if the report has come from their base. So the system will say, okay, this report came from Edinburgh. Are there any base flight safety managers selected for Edinburgh? No. So then we discount that entirely. So ideally, there's no real reason why you should not have that selected, because if you have not designated anyone, then it doesn't matter. Right. Having the reporter here is a nice thing to have, because again, it promotes the open safety culture. It's especially nice to have them here in Reporter. So you might be wondering, why would a reporter need an initial alert? Surely they would know because they've just submitted it. But remember, we have here in global settings, report manager sends first alerts. So what that means, again, is that the person who processes the report gets a chance to review it before sending the alerts and opening the investigation. So this way, the reporter can know when that has been done and when the investigation on their report has been started. And it doesn't matter whether it's a confidential report or not, they'll just get a notification. Down here under investigation personnel, now it does matter. So you can see that if the report is confidential, then the reporter will not be added to the list, because obviously then you can tell who reported it. So investigation personnel, people who need to contribute to the investigation in some way, again, strongly recommend using roles where possible instead of names. So you can see Matt Hayes is now inactive, and the system will actually automatically deselect any inactive personnel when you do that. But if you have a change, then obviously you need to go through each and every one. So these personnel can be the same or can be separate as initial alert. And in fact, if I come to global settings and let's just give it a second, disable report manager sends first alerts, you will note that we only have investigation personnel because they're the people who need to get notified. So having report manager sends first alerts is something that I do recommend having ticked, simply because it allows you that little bit more granular control over how these reports are processed in your system. Okay. Then we come to safety hierarchy. Which safety officer role is the report manager? So again, the report manager, that term does not have to be used. It's defined here. By default, it's champion, but you can call it whatever you like. I like report manager, but you might choose lead investigator or something like that. And when I edit this, this is just a single selection. You cannot have multiple selections there. So in this case, for low and medium risk, I'm quite happy to let the base safety officer take care of this. But let's say for medium risk, I actually want the flight safety manager. Remember these selections here to process it. And for high and extreme risk, I need the chief safety officer or officers, because remember this, you can have multiple personnel selected here. I need them to process the report. Then finally, sign-off personnel who need to approve this report before it can be closed. And again, this is exactly the same drop-down list as you've seen before. You might like to have the reporter show that they're happy with how their safety report has been processed, but that's really up to you. One thing I didn't mention is you can switch the picker mode here. And what that does is it changes how these names are sorted. So it can either be by base and then department, by base, by everyone, or just by department. And if you're struggling to find someone, just try clicking that, or you can just type in their name like so. Then we come to access levels. So as you should be aware, each profile on Air Maestro gets a specific set of access levels, which define what they can see and what they can do on the system. For safety reporting, although in fact safety reporting is a bit of a misnomer because you can use it for all sorts of reporting, we have controls for safety reports. Modify self means that they can submit their own report, and you can have view self. You can only see your own reports. You can see a selection of reports. You can see all reports. By itself, these don't do anything. They must work in conjunction with the settings at the bottom here. So let's say our drug test report, for example. This is sensitive information. I do not want anyone to see it. And you can see that all of these boxes are empty, meaning that only the report managers can see it. For lodging the report, again, modify self only works when that particular person has permission to lodge the report here. Otherwise, it will not appear in the report type selection available to them. So again, those are critical to set up, and you can click Save when you are done there. So one thing to note is that your changes to these roles, for example, are not automatically pushed out as soon as you make that change. So let's say you have a change of Chief Safety Officer, Safety Manager. That person might have old reports. Okay, I've got a question here from the, what if you want the confidential reports to be part of the investigation personnel to comment on the process? Right now, there is no way to anonymously put comments into the forum. So you can, the reporter would have to go and look at the report itself. Otherwise, another option would be to create a profile on your site, which is called confidential, and distribute those login details freely. Although I don't necessarily recommend that, because then anyone who logs in will be able to see those reports. So right now, a confidential information report, the reporter would have to go and check on it themselves. Where was I? Right, so we changed the flight safety manager to include Timothy Kane, but he's not on this list, which is why we have this refresh reports button. So what this does is it looks at all reports that have not yet been closed, so all open reports, and it will refresh the personnel who are involved. So that's report managers, investigation, and sign-off. So if I click refresh and then refresh this page, you can see that the personnel here have changed because the system has looked at the tables as we set them up here and reviewed who needs to be involved. So if there's a sign-off that you cannot obtain because someone's no longer with the company, you can change the role selections or the selections down here and refresh reports, and that will allow you to process and close those reports. Right, so I've talked for about an hour. We've got 10 minutes for any more questions and answers. Please feel free to send a message and I will try and answer them. So I've got a question here. A reporter will set the risk when reporting the hazard. How is it reviewed by the end? Oh, right, so how can you demonstrate a mitigation of risk? That's quite simple. You can only do it in the investigation phase. So once you've progressed, once you've opened the forum, and to demonstrate a mitigation of risk, you click Edit at the top right here. You can select the new risk, so once it's been mitigated, and put in a comment to show how it was mitigated. So new ACAS I can update that. You'll see the risk at the top right here will change. And here under report risks, I have the history of the risks. So we can see the mitigations as they've come in. Any other questions? It's a pleasure. Anyone else have something they'd like to cover? In case you're struggling, you can click on the GoToWebinar control panel and submit a question or put something into the chat. I will leave it open for another couple of minutes. If nothing else, then you are more than welcome to message us at help@cairnaviation.com, and I'll put that in the browser here. And that will go to our help desk, and we'll be more than happy to send you a more private response. Okay, I don't see anything else coming in, so I'm going to close the webinar. If you missed some of it, or if you were not able to listen for the entirety, I will be uploading this to YouTube slightly later today. If you haven't followed our YouTube channel, please do so, and you'll get notified whenever we put up a new webinar, and you can see all of the old ones. Thank you very much to everyone who attended, and I will hopefully see you for the next one.